Hi, I'm Sandja Brügmann, and this is New Global Mind, where we explore leadership for systems transformation. Welcome, and thanks for joining us. I am excited to introduce today's guest, Kasper Bjørkskov. He is an architect, author, scientist, and activist focused on turning minority insights into majority actions, making sustainability and social change accessible to all. He's blending architecture, climate science, and regenerative economy to simplify complex problems into innovative, practical solutions. He's the founder and managing director of the nonprofit No Objectives. It is such a pleasure for me to welcome you here today, Kasper. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'm super excited to jump into this conversation. Power versus life, and the tagline being reclaiming meaning, wisdom, and collective action in the age of power.
Yeah, that's quite a title.
Yes, we don't go the easy route here. We
No,
tackle the big questions, and of course, New Global Mind leadership for systems transformation is exactly that, a systemic exploration of how do we create thriving on planet Earth. And this is one of the important conversations to have. What is your thinking when you pose power and life as opposites?
I think the core reality that is in that terminology is that power as expressed through technology, exploitation, expansion, and control, sort of the mechanisms that we see quite prevalent in our societies today. Life is the connection, meaning, and wisdom and caring that we've seen and grown up with in our entire human history has now been diminished, and those seem to be at odds with each other in this fairly recent new system we are entering. So the idea was trying to see there's this weird duality where the scales are so skewed. So what do we do about that, and why did we actually get here? Why is it that power is dominant now instead of life in our current system?
I think posing that question, not that we need to have all the answers, but we can certainly explore what are you seeing? What am I seeing?
Yeah,
So the power age, where does it come from? How has it evolved?
and I think it's a longer history of how it evolved, but I will say, like, just before we dive into that, there's this quote from Charles Eisenstein that I really like because it really fits for how we got to this left hemisphere brain thinking. I can just read it aloud really quick. The concept of efficiency, how much one can accomplish per unit of time or per dollar, requires a quantitative numerator as well as a denominator. It requires a metric, therefore it tells us nothing about the result we cannot quantify or measure. When we gear our society around efficiency, we produce more and more of the measurable, while the immeasurable, the qualitative, and the things we don't think we're to measure drain away. Bedazzled by quantitative abundance, we might not be able to see what we lost, but we definitely can feel its absence. And I think
Mm,
that is such a good explanation for how we got here,
mm,
because we live in a system where we want to quantify everything. It's a system built on science, and science needs to be backed by data, and data need to be able to be replicated and also become science. Ever since the Enlightenment, we've sort of gradually geared ourselves towards this understanding that we need to be able to measure it before it has to be true. Some things in life cannot be measured. You cannot measure the qualitative state of being with your friends. It's not a measure. It's something you just intrinsically know, or caring for others, or all of those things. That's also why I love feminist economy, because it's really good at understanding that the economy measures all the wrong things. So it can never measure the nurture of being a mom, or actually the love we have for each other, but it can definitely quantify it.
mm.
So I think that's a really good starting point for sort of why we got here, is that with the Enlightenment, with the advent of science, I'm by no means against science at all, but I think we've ended up with what Ian McGilchrist calls a left hemisphere thinking. The right hemisphere is more for sensing, for ritual, for wisdom, and the other one is more reasoning. We ended up in this weird society where everything has to be reasoned through numerical values and quantitative data, and
Mm.
that has sort of skewed our whole society. And I think that's what we're seeing right now, becoming evident. Why at least most of us maybe have never, from a quantitative point of view, never had it better, but from a qualitative point of view, we are more sick than ever. We are
Mm.
lonely, stressed, anxious. So I think we can feel it, that there's something wrong, but there's no evidence really to support it other than a few data points.
Yeah, the new Gallup workplace survey just came out, and the data is just horrific. Year upon year, more and more people are stressed, depression,
Yeah,
anxiety, and so forth. And we also see with the younger generation that emerged probably 5, 7 years ago, the climate anxiety, something is definitely off. And those of us
yeah.
that are more sensitive or sensing, those of us that have not been numbed by the propaganda of the system or that way of thinking, we have felt it sooner. More people are certainly waking up to this challenge.
It's like the cognitive dissonance, the idea that, you feel it, there's something wrong, but you cannot really point a finger to it. Or the worst part is, which I mean, I've been through in my life, it's having to go to work, knowing what you do actually actively undermines the entire, planet and works against your kids having a future. But you do it anyway because you need to put food on the table. And I have immense respect for that, because it's not about just opting out, because people can't. If people are struggling just to survive, just telling them
Mm.
to do something more purposeful is really like the most privileged point of view you can have. So I don't think that's the case, but I think that is what people are struggling with. We feel trapped, especially in the very rich part of the world. It's sort of a first world problem, I would say. But this idea that we have to go to work and we have to pay off our mortgages, we have to pay off the cars, and that means that we actually can never get out of this trap where we feel we have to go to work even though we hate what it actually means to do it. I think that's why we
Yeah.
see this giant survey after survey saying that people are so sad when they actually go to work. And I think that's a big part of it.
Materially, we have never been better off, and
No,
emotionally felt more disconnected, sad, and distraught.
exactly.
Uh, and I think it's very important also what you highlight. It's not to shame anyone. It's not to
No,
say what you're doing over there is not right. It
no.
is to enlighten, it is to educate, because what Renee Litzman, a climate psychology that I find very intriguing and important in her work, says there's that tendency to tell, yell, sell from a
Yes.
climate scientist perspective. And of course, no one likes to be told,
No.
do it differently than what you're doing, or because then we're superior and we're talking down to people. That never works. It never works to yell at people,
No.
and it never works to sell anyone anything. So it's really about guiding. And that's also what your work and your writing is about. It is about becoming more aware. So how did we get here?
I think one of the more important lessons is that we have to take a step further back in history and say, where did this actually come from? When did we enter this crisis of meaning? And because when we understand how it started, we also understand how to leave that society or that system again. So in my mind, at least what I have had deducted is that it all starts with surplus. So surplus, I don't mean surplus of money. That's it for now, but it started before that. When we started to cultivate the land, we were able to store energy from the sun in food. So we could cultivate the land, we could store food, and it enabled us to have a surplus of energy that meant that we had a much higher chance of survival, which is of course really great. But what then happened, that with that surplus, we were able to create civilization and hierarchies and so forth. And also, so we created kingdoms, we created boundaries, all of the things that weren't there before because you were tied to the land. Now you're basically tied to your surplus. And what happened was that in some weird way, surplus was this way of giving us the freedom to choose, but it also made us able to disconnect. So what I mean by that is that in a world of surplus where you're not dependent on the land anymore, because you can just produce the same food enough anywhere because of agriculture, you are able to remove yourself from situations you didn't like. Before, you were forced to collaborate and cooperate with your tribe, but now with the surplus, you get the opportunity to actually disconnect from the community. It's not just that you disconnect from the community, it's that you also disconnect from the land, because all of a sudden you are able to live a life without the need for understanding the ways of how the land works and other people. And then if you fast forward that to what happens today, is that basically we are able to live our lives completely independent of other people. And we have this completely fetishizing way of understanding surplus, because our whole economy, our entire system works on profit maximization. So what happens is that when that's the key driver for a society or a system, it becomes more and more complex, because more and more power equals more and more energy, equals more and more structures. And then what coincidentally happens is that you grow wheel, it's called Lodka's wheel. Basically, the more energy there is in a system, the larger it expands, the more complex it gets. The more complex the system, the more simple the outcome. And I think it's really interesting to think about that, because as our society has been more and more complexified and grown bigger and bigger, we become more and more homogeneous. Basically, we're all like this American model that everyone has, at least in Western society, has modeled their societies around. And so prevalent, all the deep-seated knowledge-based traditions of indigenous cultures, or actually just local culture, has been completely removed because they didn't fit that mold. So I think that understanding of surplus and how you're able to store and disconnect are key fundamental reason why we are entering this state, because we don't have to struggle with the hard things anymore. We can basically just take ourselves out of the situation. And the most compelling example I can give is that, at least in Western societies, if you don't like where you live, or you think the neighbor is annoying or someone else is annoying, you can just leave the community. That leaving the community means that no one ever really makes an effort in the community, and therefore the community never really thrives, because communities thrive on diversity and understanding and reciprocity. But when you can just leave, there is no need for this anymore. The richer you are, you generally have a less and less of community, which is also super interesting. It's almost like the system is about getting as rich as possible so you don't have to be with other people. So if you get really wealthy, you get a private jet because you can then get away from everyone else. But if you're not really wealthy, then you have to sit with everyone else, right? And that's the same with the big mansions, and you live in gated communities and all of that stuff, right? I think that surplus is what actually got us here, that understanding of storing and holding energy.
So the skewing of power coming with the abundant accumulation of wealth. If we want to solve for anything, in system science, we talk about transcending. So if we want to transcend this quagmire, it's kind of like a Chinese finger puzzle. The more you pull, the more you are stuck in that situation, and it gets worse and worse. What's the root cause?
Yeah, I think the root cause is that with our society evolving in this way, we basically lost the connection to what matters, which is to each other and to all living beings, and understanding that we are part of each other. So basically, when you are able to store that much surplus that you can disconnect, what happens is that you fail over generations to understand that you are dependent on not just each other, but also the land. The disconnection is what has caused this. And it starts with the surplus. But the thing is that you could use surplus in the right way. Sort of, it was a good thing to help you survive, that you could actually store food. But instead, we used it as this way to sort of create power over each other. And I think for me, that's not a natural thing that occurred, but it occurred because we were not aware of sort of the actual rules that govern this sort of system, which is the interconnectedness and the reciprocity and the diversity that there is. And I think what is interesting is that there's cultures, indigenous cultures today, that has been through this entire sort of period of time that had kept that understanding, and they are thriving. There was a really interesting research paper that came out a year ago that looked at the indigenous communities all around the world, and it found that on a measurable score, of course, again, this quantitative instead of qualitative, but they actually benchmarked higher than the highest ranking richest nation, even though they had no money. And I think that's the intriguing part. We sort of thought that with this surplus and hoarding of wealth and food, we would get to a higher level of sort of well-being, but the opposite has happened, right?
Yeah, that is interesting. Do you remember what that tribe was called?
It was multiple tribes. From the Blackfoots to the Kogis in Amazon, they took all around the world. So a meta study.
If we want to transcend, and I think most people really want to feel better. They want to feel connected. They want to feel meaning. I work with primarily top leaders in private enterprises and multi-stakeholder transformations. What I hear is that there is that desire for purpose, for meaning, for contribution, for leaving a legacy, that what I did with my time and my capabilities and my influence actually mattered in a positive way. No one sets out to actually want to be destructive, but there's something underneath that's driving. And that's what I would like to get to. What is that driving that underneath? Even if we want a different outcome, we still keep creating some of the same re-traumatizing patterns.
I think it's cultural. It starts as a system switch and then it becomes cultural. Freedom now is freedom to consume. That's not what freedom actually is, right? So I don't think it's like there's an underlying trauma that created this. I think it's a system that allows us to act in a certain way that then creates a cultural norm that is self-reinforcing. But if you go to the Blackfoot indigenous leaders, their culture is the complete opposite. If you hoard or if you have a surplus, it's the worst possible thing you can have. You are judged by how much you give back, not how much you take. I think that's a really beautiful sort of understanding of what it means to be alive, is that the more you can give to others, the better of a life you actually have. And I think that is very difficult. I think most people intuitively agree and can see themselves that it's not about having the bigger car or the big house, but it's about having good friends. So everyone knows when they are on their deathbed, what would they be remembered for? What do they remember? It's never the long working hours. It's always the time with family and friends. We know this. The problem is that the system cannot allow you to do it. So that's the problem, because when the surplus is all you are maximizing for, opting out of that system becomes almost impossible. And you can actually only do it if you're really privileged. So you can, of course, one of the things that inspired me, which is also one of the things I think we can get out of the system, is Kate Saper wrote an amazing book called Post-Growth Living. In that book, she has a term that she described called alternative hedonism. It's about teaching yourself to live a life where that's not about consumption. And then she says how you can basically choose not to buy the bigger house, or you can choose to work less hours if you downscale, or you can choose to have your own garden, or you can choose all of these things that makes you less dependent on the system. And that's what I did. I read that book and I thought, what a great idea. And then me and my wife decided that we are not gonna buy that bigger house. We're going to stay in a small 80 square meter flat with our 2 kids, even though that's still incredibly privileged. I know that. But all of my other friends were buying houses, moved outside the cities, all of that. But we chose not to do that. And then we chose to not have a car. We chose to do all of these things and made sure that we could be independent in what we do. So now we're not as dependent on the system as we were. And then we choose to do things that are not based on consumption. So we don't travel by plane. Instead of taking the all-inclusive holiday to Mallorca, we go on summer house trips with all our friends and their kids. And to be honest, it's been like before we used to do all the other stuff. It's been much better holidays both for us and the kids, because you get to be with your friends and you get to see your kids be with other kids and they play around all day. And that's just good. So I think there's a way to teach ourselves to get out of this situation. And then the cultural norms begin to change. But it starts with us taking action.
I think it's interesting because what you're talking about is the Native American tribes that were studied and what's valued in terms of behavior. And what we value directs behavior, because as human beings, from both a psychological and a neuro perspective, we are dependent for survival. We used to be dependent on survival to be part of the group.
Yeah.
Now, to some degree, we actually still are. The consumption-based culture, we are still dependent on the tribe because we're in that system. So we just do what everyone else does, even though we burn ourselves out. We feel terrible. Life is not fulfilling. It's not meaningful, but we just keep because it's valued in that system. Whereas in the indigenous cultures, they value different things. So the behavior is promoted that is good for the collective. It's a collective intelligence. So what do we place value on?
Yeah. And I think that's where it becomes interesting, because I think there's this false notion that action comes from values, but it's actually the other way around. It's repeated behaviors gives you values. That's how it works. It's not the other way around. So if we understand that, that's how the Blackfoots understand that, because they have patterns, rituals, ways of engaging that allows them to enter into a system where they repeatedly make actions for others, and then you begin to value them. I think that's a little bit the problem with Western societies. We think that we can do introspection and then their values change. But actually what happens when we do that is that we think about all the things we want to do, and then it never materializes because we don't do them. And then it becomes a negative emotion. And at some point, you disengage. At some point you say no. Whereas if you do the other thing, you start to make the changes by taking action. You see a shift, and automatically, if you repeat the behavior over time, it even rewires your brain to think that you are that person. And then it becomes embedded within your value system. And I think that that's sort of a very important thing that we continuously miss when we talk about this. I've also been in offices where we talk about this. We create strategies where we can talk about what our values are, but we don't live them. And when you then don't live them, it becomes so shallow and the cognitive dissonance completely erodes. But when you start to actually practice those values that you preach, it becomes a positive feedback loop instead of a negative one. I think that is incredibly true to start like that.
I couldn't agree more. And so it is, one thing is to say you have a value, but if you behave completely differently, then there's a disconnect there. How are we living our lives? And you were saying you and your wife decided you wanted something different for your family because you wanted to align how you were actually living, what you deemed important, the values, what you valued. And so you create behaviors to
Yeah.
align with that kind of life. But also from an organizational perspective, there's kind of been this boom of the purposeful organization, start with why,
Yeah.
which is a fantastic framework. And Simon
Yeah.
Sinek has done great work in waking up some of the level of awareness, but all these fantastic, very meaningful words that are
Yeah.
not put into action. There's a huge disconnect between what organizations say their purpose is and how they are actioning on it. But not to shame it, but to really say, is that a natural evolution of humanity becoming more conscious, a society becoming more conscious?
My gut feeling is that it's actually I don't want to shame it either, because also Simon Sinek and the whole framework has also helped me, because I think it's easy, applicable, and it hits all the right sort of spots for having a conversation about what is a company, what should it do, and all that. I think those are fruitful conversations. But I will say I actually think it hurts more than it does good, because what it ends up doing is that it ends up enabling us to say all the things we wish. And then when we can't deliver on those things, the whole thing comes crumbling down, and the cognitive dissonance is strengthened again. We built entire continents on this. Europe is based on human rights and democracy, but we let people drown that try to try to actually flee from war, and we sit idly by while Gaza is being ethnically cleansed in a genocide. I think that whole idea of we can just say the purpose we have, but if we can't back it up, or if we don't live by it, it becomes sort of a very targeting and almost hurtful way of
Mm,
being in the world. So I would
yeah.
almost say it's like start with the how, or what. Like, what can I do? Like, what can I do right now to try to live more according to the values? Because I also think it's important to say you cannot live according to good values in a system based on bad ones. Or even if I want to, I would not be able to live aligned with planetary boundaries, or ensuring that I don't hurt anyone else. Because the moment I cross the street, my taxpayer money is used for exploitation of the global south somewhere. So I think it's important to understand that there's no purity in this. You cannot be pure. We're all complicit. But what we can try to do is that we can say, how can I help change this system? How can I make it so that the system doesn't work like this? And then it becomes a collective matter and not an individualistic one. And I think that's the place we need to get to.
The collective action.
Yeah.
So potent and so real and so raw. And I think this is also a time where masks need to fall,
Yes.
masks need to fall. And that's really what we're doing here.
Yeah. But deep down, humans are caring, loving, and amazing people. I truly believe that. I truly believe that there's the best in everyone. I think the system that we created is the issue.
Mm.
I don't believe humans are inherently greedy. Actually, I believe it's not true when people say that, because we know for a fact that we lived in huge million inhabitant cities, completely altruistic. We know that from the archaeologists. So I don't think that it's supposed to be like this. I think there's another way, that's what gives me hope. I think that yes, we created this monster of a system, but yes,
Yeah,
we can also find a different way to live.
we can find a different way. The more people that want that and that collectively action on that,
Yes.
we can create a different way of being. And certainly, I'm hopeful. Um, uh, Alexander Laszlo, system scientist that I interviewed on the podcast, that drop down on Earth today and you look around, you wouldn't know if it was heaven or hell
Oh, that's
because
true.
both exist. But I find it quite uplifting that you see it as it's the systems, the models of the systems, the way the systems are created that are creating the destruction, and that inherently, if we change the systems and what's being valued within those systems,
Yeah.
humans' behavior will follow.
Yeah. I can actually give a quite real example about this, which I think is a good sort of understanding of how change happened. I'm trained as an architect as a background. So I ran a research and design department for 8 years, focusing on how to transition the industry into an industry that could be restoring rather than depleting the earth. And of course, that you don't do that overnight. So I think the first mistake environmental groups do is that they go for a leverage point that's too far away, rather than understanding that you can't deliver on systems transformation overnight. It's a step-by-step process. So the way I like to talk about this is that the human rights movement understood this. So instead of saying we want equal rights for everyone, that's only the thing we're marching for, they understood that it was ending segregation and it was positive affirmation and so forth. So they did sort of, they had one outline period was equal rights for everyone, but they understood that they had to create the sort of the cascading tasks that could get through to get to there. That's what made them very successful. And that's what the environmental movement has been incredibly poor at, because what has happened is that we're asking for radical system transformation, and it definitely needs to be there. I'm all for that. That's what we're aiming at. But we fail to understand how that system can change, because we cannot replace power overnight. It doesn't happen. So one really good example is that from the industry I represent, it's one of the most destructive industries in the world. But at least in Denmark, we said, let's try to do something about it. And some scientists said, okay, now what matters is what we measure. So could we come up with a way to measure the CO2 impact of housing? And it became a tool called LCA, so life cycle assessment. Many people work with this, but this one was specifically for the Danish industry. And everyone was like, no, it's more compliance. We won't do it. It's the worst. It was enforced anyway. What happened was that when people started working with it, taking action, all of a sudden it became a competitive parameter. It became, we want to do this. Then we got a regulation that cap how much it can emit over time, so it reduces gradually. And that turned in, we saw that movement saying that, okay, we went from measuring this, now it became a competitive advantage. I organized with other companies a project called Reduction Roadmap, where we actually got the entire building industry, something that's completely unheard of for any other industry, to come together to ask legislators to regulate us so we would be in line with the Paris Accord. It was everyone. It was the smallest sort of niche company or carpenter to the biggest developer in the Nordic regions, to all the municipalities in Denmark said this. And the reason why that could happen was that we had those steps. And then the next steps are then hopefully, let's stop building so much. Then you can take the next steps. But it's understanding that gradual journey that will allow for the system transformation. And I mean, it's quite rare to see what happened just in Denmark with this, because 3 years ago, it was unthinkable to say, let's stop building new homes. And today there's a huge movement called the Building Stop movement that's actually gaining traction and is seriously being discussed. One of the political parties has already taken it under their mandate. So I think that's a really important lesson to learn, that if we want to change systems, work with it to start with, to transition it slowly into what you need it to be. And I get that can seem frightening when we don't have a lot of time, but actually these things can like happen incredibly quick. From just having a way to measure LCA in 3 years to now talking about building stop in Denmark, that's really a quick progression. But I think that's what we need to learn, and that's what everyone needs to start understanding, that need to ask for those things that become the Trojan horse that can move to the next stages.
That's a wonderful example. And the narrative is many people are scared because the meta crisis is exacerbating, and we're way past many of the planetary boundaries, and it's not a target, it's a limit. It's not looking so good. But what's also underneath all of this is, that intelligence that we can't see and measure. We can talk about emergence,
Yeah.
there is an opening and a readiness and a consciousness, and enough people grouped together, and something can change quite quickly. And that's really
exactly.
in quantum science that is studied.
Exactly. And I will talk quantum science. I mean, that's another way to approach this, is that there's an understanding that you become what is you sort of, what you put your attention to. And I think there's a way for us to understand that social media can actually be, I think they brought very little positive with them, the social media, because they are exactly the power versus life dynamic, because they're run on pure power. But we can use them as a tool to shape perception, to ensure that people are becoming aware, are creating this emergence. It's something I've been debating. Generally, it's this thing that we in the climate community should never uh, communicate fear or anger or any of those things, because they will paralyze. When in fact, we know from science that those are actually the biggest ways to get people motivated. But you can utilize fear they are emotions. They're not inherently bad. Fear and anger can be incredibly healthy, because they are healthy expressions of yourself, but they can also be used for bad. So the far right has been utilizing fear and anger for many years to divide and isolate us.
Yeah, to suppress and
That's
dominate.
what and it's been incredibly effective, right?
Yes.
But we can also use fear and anger to mobilize and to connect and to put ourselves together, because that's what Friday for Futures was with Greta Thunberg.
Mm.
I'm really angry.
Yeah.
I want to do something about this. So I think, and in that sense, I think we should learn to use the algorithms more in that favor, not to polarize, but to actually group or to
Mobilize.
mobilize. Yeah.
Each of the different disciplines, whether it's marketing, social media, business, leadership, all these different vehicles, they're not inherently bad.
No.
They can be used in the right direction. We use some different words and see things a little bit differently, which is wonderful, because that's the systemic perspective. And we need all hands on deck, all
100%.
perspectives on deck to be able to navigate this. But it's the thinking. And as for Jeff Capra, the world-renowned physicist and system scientist, it's the perception. And what I'm seeing is it's our level of consciousness.
Yeah.
You say our thinking is the issue. Because if we think differently and we action differently, we can actually use leadership. We can use the vehicle of business. All these different vehicles can be used to mobilize for proper action.
Yes, I agree with that. I think the harder thing is to get businesses of today to do it, because it is almost impossible for a business to act according to those values that we are trying to enforce, because they will always, if they have been around for at least some time and they have shareholders and they live in that sort of realm, they are actually not able to opt out. They cannot do that. And I think that's the tricky part. So when do we have to get new businesses in to take over? And I'm also working with some that are there today trying to make the transition. But I will say it's getting very difficult to do, because there is so many guardrails trying to keep the system at bay.
Yeah, and from a psychological perspective, so I know you said you believe it's a system and the way it's constructed. The way I'm seeing it, it's fear-based and it's generational trauma that's running within people
Yeah.
that makes it very difficult to break out of, because it requires an enormous amount of courage. And
Yeah.
you have to know that there's something on the other side. If I have to do this amazing lift, what you're doing is restructuring your cognitive process and the way you're
Yes.
really seeing and operating, experiencing yourself. So there's a layer of fear, trauma, and pain to move through. Joseph Campbell calls it the hero's journey. I think we need to be careful of the hero analogy, because then again, we become special individualist, and that's not what this is about. But it's really ascending that layer of conditioning that keeps us trapped within that system. And the system is the conditioning. So it requires an inordinate amount of willpower, courage. You have to be so much in pain. Also on a collective level, we have to be so much in pain, and we have to see this way of operating is actually destroying our foundation for life, which is planet Earth. And we're in the trajectory of eradicating ourselves. And there's a pretty big likelihood that we are going to do that, but there's also a likelihood that we can action differently, but we need to wake up.
I think one of the keys for that is about making the journey the beneficial thing. Because I think we are also in the climate movement quite sometimes like, let's just do utopias. or hopes so people can be hopeful. But people don't really care about what's going to happen in 50 years. They want to have something positive happen right now. And I think there is a lot of positive and great things to say about people that are taking action together, because the community you get, the friendships, the feeling of doing something, it's much bigger than just hoping that there will be a better future. So I think we need as a community to be much better at saying, when we do this, we do it together, we heal the collective trauma that I agree with is there, but that can be a great process. It can also be incredibly caring when you do it with other people.
Absolutely. Just want to make sure that the listeners did not misunderstand what I was saying, because healing trauma, it does require that you have to face what you've been trying to run away from, which is really inherently some feelings inside yourself that was really scary for you when you were a very little child and you had no way of knowing. Your brain was just developing. You did not know anything, and you were just trying to survive. And that enormous amount of fear and stress and cortisol hormones that were racing through your brain and body, that made you so fearful. So that internal core, it created, in some transformational methodologies, they call it chief feature, the chief feature. And within each of us, we all have it. It's some manner of underlying belief system. Most people are not aware of it at all, but it runs our life. In that core, it says, I'm not worth loving. I'm not good enough. Some measure of that internal fear of survival.
Yeah.
But in the collective sense, when you reach out, I'm ready to heal, or I'm ready to be part of the collective. I want to get out of this trap. And you get met. That connection point is so healing. And that's what the collective really is about, the collective action. But it's par for the core, but it can be incredibly healing and joyful, because when you have a collective of people that also operate and understand this, and you have a direction, you're actioning on a common cause, like you're saying, the friendships, the bonds, the connection, we heal each other in that kind of collective while we are actioning.
And it can even be subconscious, because I think everyone coming to the realization of trying to heal trauma is probably difficult, but trauma is also healed when we don't know it's being healed, because it is actually in the relationship with good values that align with what you have. You get that understanding through others. Right? You can get out of it. So that's why I really think this collective action is the most important part of it. And I think there's a brilliant book by Sarah Lubrano called Don't Talk About Politics. And she is into how the brain rewires and how we are socially engaging with each other. And one thing she says is the key reason why we are stuck in this moment right now is something she called social atrophy. And that's basically the fact that because we've seen this disconnect and we don't need the community anymore, we get worse and worse at interacting with people socially. It's actually our frontal cortex shrinks, and then we get worse and worse at social cues. That's why it's very difficult to get people to engage in movements, because it's much harder today to do a social gathering with people you don't know than it was a long time ago, where you sort of were a part of the community all the time. I think that's such a important thing to understand, because it's about getting the social connections to revive again if we want to create this healing process and create this transition. Because if we don't get to a level where we see each other, we have to meet to make things work and learn all these social skills again, we're going to drift further and further from each other, and our sort of traumas are going to get worse and worse and worse, and we're never going to actually get to deal with them. Start a food co-op is a good place to start, because it forces you to interact with people, and you can buy in bulk and do it cheaply, and all those positive things about finding the actions you can take that increases social connection while doing the right things. And I think that's a quite beautiful way to sort of understand how we can make movements or make people more aware of this sort of problem.
I think it will also be approachable to more people. By getting a group of collective together, we're actually healing underlying senses of separation and trauma and so forth. But we don't actually need to talk about it or know it, so to speak, because we can action in a collective, action towards a shared common goal. And in that collective, we're learning, we're increasing our emotional intelligence, our relational intelligence, that collective intelligence. And when we are met and we are included, some of that pain from separation is by itself in that meeting and that contact healing.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the core things that make people feel well-being and actually okay with their life is, do I have a community? Do I have someone that can help me? Can I figure out what I'm doing? Do I feel like I can navigate this life? And thirdly, do I have the skills needed to do this work? We live in a society where we basically don't have any of those anymore. And most of us are struggling to get by because it's a very difficult life. We probably don't always feel like we have the skills to be the best mom and dad in the world and be the best employee and all that. Or at least we hold to impossible standards that we feel like we're not there and the community is not there anymore, right? It's more and more people are lonely. It's harder and harder to have time to meet with friends, right? So I think community is the first place to start, because if you get that base, you can learn through that community how to be in the world in the other parameters and understand that I'm good enough and we're all doing this together. And I think that's sort of my hope and why I think it's so important that we start talking about communities and why this is a way out of it and collective action.
What you're saying is really the title of the talk being power versus life. So community and collective action is really that life-giving way of operating in the world, as opposed to
Yes.
power, which is separation and accumulation of abundance. Or
Yes.
what did you call it?
Power is this idea of separation and extraction and, hierarchies and dominance.
Mm,
Whereas the other thing is community care and reciprocity and those things. And I think community is the starting foundation of all of this, because care comes from interrelationships. You have it with other people. You can also have self-care, but self-care is all incredibly important to have without feeling secure. So I think community is where these things start. And I
mm,
think we have entered into sort of a quite dangerous trajectory with how we understand this polycrisis and the climate crisis, by sort of trying to say that it's individual actions and then the system will change. If you think that, that's because you don't understand the system, because the system doesn't work in supply and demand anymore. It's not like if we all stop buying Coca-Cola, that's not going to happen because we don't buy Coca-Cola. We are literally induced to do it through advertising and price gouging and all of those things. So we
mm,
need
mm,
to not shame people from individual actions and acknowledge that people are different places in their lives and cannot do all the right thing and be pure. We need to
mm,
then understand it's about coming together and saying, what can we do together? And that's how you change the system, by shaming individuals, but coming together to say, we would want to change the system. This is what we're
mm.
going to try to do. And that's what I think power versus life is. That it's a quite good example of trying to solve the climate crisis or the polycrisis with individual actions, or solving it through community.
And for those listeners that are interested also in hearing it from a different framing from Alexander Laszlo, that's episode 1. And you might also enjoy listening to that. We're seeing the same way out of this mess with different type of lenses. And I love that that's emerging. I think that's also why it's important to have these conversations, because we get the architectural background, the new system science background. Then there's someone with a finance background. There's me with a psychology and leadership background. And we
Yeah.
start to see that the resonance, it's a layer of resonance that where we
Yeah.
actually starting to see the same thing, because then action also becomes possible.
100%. I do, however, think that the most important thing that I would like to convey is that I think we have so many insights. What we're missing is action. If I can encourage anyone to do anything, it's that it's not that people don't know what to do, it's that they don't know how to do it. So help them figure out how to do these things, how to create the communities, because it's super difficult. It is really, really difficult. And even though I say all these things, that's what I also struggle with. How can my action actually help facilitate those communities?
Mhm.
I haven't found the answer yet, but hopefully I will keep digging at least.
We'll keep at it. The double slit experiment was quite interesting. You included in your article. Um, can you put it in context of this discussion?
Yeah, the double slit experiment is the experiment from quantum physics, where we found out that we've thought that there was a rationality between how particles move, but the double slit experiment showed that whenever we observe something else, it actually acts in a different way than if it's not observed. How I'm using it now, because there's many implications, because it's a big scientific breakthrough. But one thing that it said is that what you pay attention to will shape the reality. That's sort of the very simplistic my understanding of it. And I think that's a really important thing, because that is what we're talking about here, is that you as an individual can decide what you pay attention to. You can decide to pay attention to the individualistic, the power sort of dominant, wanting the more surplus, wanting all this, or you can decide and say, I want to use more of my attention on the wisdom parts, the life parts, where we engage in the community. We want the care and all of those things instead. And I think if you end up having a life where that's where you move towards, you will get more of that sort of life fulfilling energy. So I think for my sense, the double slit experiment proves something that's really interesting, is that life is interconnected, because it's not just point A to point B. It's that everything moves in tandem, basically, and it creates a reality that's uniquely to our perception, which I think is interesting, because it means that you can actually help shape your own life. And I think that's really empowering. At least I found it empowering, because it means that I have some agency in this. I can choose to have attention directed towards the things that I value as life-giving.
It's from the Hermetic standpoint, as within, so without. So you hear these ways of understanding how life works from many different traditions. And we have been divorced from how life works.
Yeah, but I think that's what you just said is so beautiful, because what it proves is that science is now doing sort of a loop back to spirituality. Science is proving spirituality right, which is maybe what we should have recognized from the beginning, right?
And I think you're actually now making a full loop to where the conversation started, where we initially talked about science, how the enlightenment and how we want to measure everything, which if we use some of the other intelligences that we have inherently as human beings, we've just learned to only trust our rational intellect, which for me is also so interesting, because the rational intellect without being open to all our intelligence is not very rational. It's actually very irrational, but we believe in that framework that that's rational. If we can open up and sense, we already know.
Yeah.
We already know. So we don't need to wait for science to catch up and have some data proof for us that, yeah, this is the direction to go. I think this is a potent conversation as well. If we really sit down and say to ourselves, what's the right thing here? What's the right thing to do?
Yeah.
We do know. We do know.
We do know. We do. I think the a little bit more difficult things in the system we are set up is the multipolar trap, is that basically in a system that rewards power over life, when you choose life, you will have a disadvantage from an individualistic standpoint. Basically an altruistic, I think it's E.O. Wilson that said this, but an altruistic individual will have a hard time competing in the system, whereas a collective that's altruistic outcompetes the other ones. And that's what business needs to learn, because if business understood this, that's how you change things. And I think my example of reduction roadmap is actually quite aligned with this, because instead of asking every single individual company to adhere to the science, everyone gets to go together to ask for the system to be placed so everyone has the same outcome. Because what happens when you do that is that now people don't compete against each other, and there's no one that can take all the easy decisions and don't care about the other and be completely selfish. But when you go together, everyone has the same playing field. And that's how you break the multipolar trap, because then we are all in this together and we work for a collective. And I think that's why it's so important to understand. If we want to get out of the system, you can't get along.
It's moving from me to we. So having that collective space where we have a common goal here and we all work towards that. And no one is going to deceptively, underhandedly focus on themselves. Or if they are in that type of collective, they get exposed. And I think that's really a strength at the Passion Institute. We work with cultures and organizations to understand these principles and how a culture can actually be deliberately developmental, or a healthy culture. A healthy culture is not aggressive. It's not one-upmanship. It's not bureaucracy. And we know how much the political games within many corporate structures, if you look at that from a line item perspective, how much does that extract from the overall wealth generation within an organization? That's like upwards 40%. So if we can speak into that language of business and capitalism, and it does from that perspective also make sense to operate in these manners. McKinsey recently came out with a study where they had studied organizations where they looked at performance, power, dynamic oriented organizations. They had 4 different categories they looked at. But the ones that stood out primarily were the very performance-driven, the power-driven dynamics performed much poorer than the organizations that actually valued human well-being. We have the data. We know that the right way to go is the collective action and well-being, the connectedness, the care, the compassion in action, as you're very focused on. We need to action. Organizations can be a vehicle for that change if they want to, but they will need to want to.
Yeah, they do. I mean, one of the best ways to create that culture from the beginning or transition into it is to create a collective ownership of the company, because there is also a lot of studies that show that democratically owned institutions put well-being over profit because they all own it. I think that might be my last point, is that people think it's easier to think your way into a new way of acting than it is to act your way into a new way of thinking. But it's actually the opposite. You need to do the action if you want to create the change. And I think the best example is trying to go on a diet. You can think about wanting to lose weight, but it's not until you actually put on your running shoes and get out the door, you start becoming that sort of person. And I think we need to focus on strategies that can be implemented rather than visions, because at the start of a 100-meter race, everyone wants to win. It's the person that had the best system preparation that's going to win it. So that's what I would say to anyone. Make the right sort of preparation and strategies, and then start taking some action.
I think that's a good concluding punchline. Thank you so very much for your time and perspective, and also all the writing you do that you share with the world. It's really potent and super inspiring.
Thank you so much. It means a lot. And thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Thanks for listening. I'm your host, Sandja Brügmann. You've been listening to New Global Mind, Leadership for Systems Transformation, where we explore pathways to brighter futures. You can find us on most of your podcast channels, on YouTube, and on our website, thepassioninstitute.com. See you next time.